In 1936, a 50-year-old Spanish immigrant in Lower Manhattan had a food business and nothing left to sell. A war 4,000 miles away had cut off every supplier he had. So he bought a shipment of sardines out of Morocco. And then he did something stranger. He paid $1 for the name printed on the tin. A name that was not his. A name that meant nothing to him and belonged to somebody else's company. He did it because his own name was too hard for Americans to say. That name is Goya. It is in your kitchen right now. 9 decades later, it moves $1.5 billion of food a year across more than 2,500 products, and it is the largest Hispanic-owned food company in the United States. But here is the strange thing about this company. If you took its product catalog and laid it out in the order things were added, sardines, then plantains, then black beans, then coconut, you would not be looking at a list of groceries. You would be looking at a map of who came to America and when. Goya didn't pick products and then hunt for customers. For 40 years, it did the opposite. It let migration decide what to sell. This is the story of how a broke sardine importer built an empire by paying attention to who was arriving. If stories about American fortunes built by people nobody expected to build anything are your kind of thing, subscribe and stay. The origin of Goya is not a storefront. It is a 17-year-old boy on a boat, going the wrong direction. In 1886, in the village of Villasana de Mena, in the province of Burgos in northern Spain, a boy named Prudencio Unanue Ortiz is born. Northern Spain in the 1880s is not a place that offers a poor boy very much. It offers him a decision. In 1903, at 17, Prudencio leaves, and he does not go to New York. He goes to San Lorenzo, Puerto Rico, a new American territory, 5 years after the Spanish-American War, at a moment when almost every ambitious young Spaniard is sailing for the mainland. Prudencio goes to the island instead and starts a small food distribution business. That decision looks like a detour. It is the entire reason the company exists. 3 decades before Goya sells a single can in New York, its founder spends his formative years learning exactly one thing: what Caribbean families cook and what they cannot get. Remember that. Everything that follows comes from it. In 1918, he sails to New York to study business. He returns to Puerto Rico, and in 1921, he marries Carolina Casal, who had come from Spain herself. The couple settles in the New York area, and Prudencio takes work as a broker, an importer's middleman, moving Spanish olives and olive oil and canned fish to grocers serving Spanish-speaking families. It is a good business. It depends entirely on Spain. In July 1936, Spain collapses into civil war. The supply lines close. The ships stop. A food broker whose entire trade runs through Spanish ports becomes, almost overnight, a man with customers and nothing to sell them. Prudencio Unanue is 50 years old, with a family, in a country in the 7th year of the Great Depression, and his business has just been cut off at the root. You already know what he does next. He buys Moroccan sardines through a Spanish supplier. He and Carolina repackage them by hand in a Manhattan warehouse and sell them to neighborhood grocers. And he pays $1 to keep the name on the tin. What is worth sitting with is why that name. Unanue, is, he judges, too difficult for American customers to say, to ask for, to remember. Goya is 2 syllables. It works in English and it works in Spanish. And it carries a faint echo of Francisco Goya, the Spanish painter, which lends a warehouse sardine operation something close to prestige. Think about what that decision actually is. A man builds a company and deliberately refuses to put his family's name on it, because he calculates that the family name would slow the product down. The family in the back, the product in the front. That is the founding instinct of this company, and it never really changes. The storefront opens on Duane Street in Lower Manhattan. Olives, olive oil, sardines. His customers are Spanish and Puerto Rican families in New York who cannot find, at any price, the food they grew up eating. And this is the part that gets flattened in the retellings, so let's be precise about it. Prudencio Unanue did not invent a product. He did not invent a process. What he identified was a gap, an American grocery system that had no interest in serving people it did not consider a market. He was not feeding a niche. He was feeding a country that was arriving. Here is where the company becomes something other than a regional importer. After the Second World War, Puerto Ricans begin arriving in New York in enormous numbers. American citizens moving within their own country into a city whose supermarkets stock absolutely nothing they recognize. Goya adds yucca, plantains, gandules, pigeon peas. In the 1950s, Cubans arrive. Goya adds black beans, guava paste. In the 1960s, Dominicans arrive. Goya adds coconut. Read that sequence again, because it is the whole company. Each new product corresponds to a new population. The catalog isn't a business plan. It's a demographic record. And Prudencio does something more aggressive than stocking shelves. He builds the supply chain backward, into the islands themselves. In 1949, with his father's money and his father's push, one of Prudencio's sons buys a cannery in Puerto Rico. Prudencio is 64 years old. That cannery becomes the nucleus of an entire Puerto Rican operation. Eventually, canneries in Bayamon, producing the things you simply could not buy in an American supermarket in 1950. Beef tripe stew, tropical juices, pastels, gandules, something like 25 different varieties of beans. Think about what that means operationally. A New York importer decided that the way to serve immigrants in Manhattan was to go build factories in the place they came from. The distribution is Bodega by Bodega. Goya salesmen walk into small Puerto Rican-owned grocery stores and take orders by hand. Not supermarkets. Bodegas. The corner stores, run by people from the same places as the customers, in the neighborhoods the big chains were not serving. Goya grew by being the company that showed up where nobody else was bothering to go. By 1969, Goya is selling from Boston to Miami and out into the Midwest. 7,000 accounts. 67 Spanish-speaking salesmen. Packaging facilities in Brooklyn. Revenue past $20 million on roughly 650 products, having grown about 35% a year, 4 years running. The company moves from Lower Manhattan to Brooklyn in 1958 and to New Jersey in 1974. A note on the record, because this is a story that has been retold a lot. The dates in Goya's own official history don't always match the dates in the business press or in court filings. Goya says Brooklyn in 1958 and New Jersey in 1974. Some accounts put a New Jersey move as early as 1956. Most sources say Prudencio emigrated in 1903 at 17. At least one says 1906 at 18, though his birth year of 1886 supports 1903. Small things, but this is a company whose mythology has been polished for 90 years, and the honest version of this story means flagging where the polish is thicker than the evidence. In March 1976, Prudencio Unanue dies. The company he leaves behind is valued at roughly $8.5 million. Some accounts say closer to 10. 40 years earlier, he had been a broke middleman with no supplier. Now for the decision that actually separated Goya from every competitor selling to the same customers. They advertised. That sounds trivial. It was not. In the 1950s, essentially nobody in the United States advertised to Hispanic consumers. The advertising industry did not consider them a market worth the media spend. There was no infrastructure for it, no agencies with the language, no research, no media plans, no interest. So when Goya went looking for an agency that understood what it was trying to do, it could not find one. It built its own. An in-house shop called Inter-Americas Advertising, created for exactly one reason, which was that the outside world would not do the work. Sit with the implication. A family of Spanish immigrants had to construct their own corner of the American advertising industry, because the American advertising industry did not believe their customers existed. And the product knowledge that came out of operating this close to the customer became something no national competitor could replicate. Here is my favorite example. Puerto Ricans in New York wanted pink beans, packed in water. Nicaraguans wanted red beans. Mexicans wanted dry beans, because they were going to refry them. To a national food conglomerate in 1970, that is one line item. Beans. To Goya, that is 3 completely different customers with 3 completely different kitchens. And getting it wrong doesn't mean a lost sale. It means a family decides you don't actually know them and stops trusting you. That is a moat you cannot buy. You can only build it by being from the place. The pattern repeats across the catalog. Goya became the company that knew the difference between what Cubans wanted and what Dominicans wanted, between what a Colombian household stocked and what a Puerto Rican one did, at a level of granularity that looked from the outside like an absurd amount of complexity for a food company to carry. It wasn't complexity. It was the product. The company Prudencio left behind kept growing. Under his son, Joseph, who ran it from 1976, Goya became one of the largest privately held food companies in America. Roughly 800 products, 2,000 employees, and around $700 million a year by 1998. Adobo and sazon stopped being specialty items and became staples in millions of American kitchens. In 2004, leadership passed to the 3rd generation. Goya crossed $1 billion in annual sales around 2010, and by 2012 was doing an estimated $1.3 billion, one of the fastest-growing food companies in the country. Part of that growth came from a strategy earlier generations had been cautious about, marketing core products like adobo and yellow rice directly to non-Hispanic households. The line the company used was that Goya didn't market to Latinos. It marketed as Latinos. Now, a word about the family, because you cannot tell this story honestly without it. 3 times in 56 years, the Unanues have fought over control of this company, and every one of those fights ended in a courtroom. In 1969, in 2004, and again in 2025, when the board removed the chief executive amid a lawsuit filed by his own cousin, a dispute that, as of this recording, has not been resolved. That is a genuinely extraordinary story, and it deserves its own episode rather than a footnote in this one. But it matters here for one reason. Not one of those fights ever cost Goya a customer. Which brings us to the strangest piece of evidence anyone has ever produced about how strong this brand actually is. In July of 2020, Goya became the target of a national boycott campaign after political comments by its chief executive. It was everywhere. The hashtags trended for days. Major outlets ran more than 1,500 stories with Goya in the headline. and a group of economists at Cornell, at Northwestern, and at Imperial College London decided to find out what actually happened to sales. They pulled detailed purchase data covering more than 33,000 American households that had bought a Goya product at least once. Here is what they found. Calls to boycott outnumbered calls to support the company by 75%. The campaign dominated the conversation completely, and it barely moved anything. Sales rose briefly, driven mostly by first-time buyers in politically sympathetic areas, then settled back to almost exactly where they had been within a few weeks. But the finding that matters is the quiet one. Goya's core customers, the Latino households the campaign was aimed at, barely changed what they bought at all. The researchers pointed to two reasons: brand loyalty built across 3 generations, and something much more practical. There is no substitute for adobo. There is no substitute for sazon. You cannot boycott a pantry staple when nothing else on the shelf replaces it. 84 years after a broke importer paid $1 for a name, the loudest consumer controversy in the company's history hit the brand, and the brand did not move. That is what it looks like when a product stops being a product and becomes an ingredient in how a few million families cook. Go back to Duane Street. A 50-year-old man with no supplier, in a country in a depression, in a city that did not care what his customers ate, buys a shipment of Moroccan sardines and pays $1 for a name that isn't his. He does it because his own name is too hard for Americans to say. The thing Prudencio Unanue understood, decades before the American food industry did, was that immigration is not a moment. It's a sequence. People keep arriving. They keep arriving from different places, and every one of them walks into a grocery store and looks for something that isn't there. He didn't build a Spanish food company. He built a machine for noticing who had just showed up and getting their food onto a shelf before anyone else thought it was worth doing. Puerto Ricans in the 40s, Cubans in the 50s, Dominicans in the 60s, Mexicans and Central Americans after that. Each wave got added to the catalog because each wave was a country that was arriving. That is why the brand is unkillable. Not marketing, not scale. Because for 3 generations, Goya was the only company that treated knowing exactly who you were as a business strategy. The name he bought for $1 turned out to be the most valuable thing he ever made. And that can is still in your pantry. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There are more fortunes like this one in this country, built by people nobody expected to build anything, and almost none of them ended the way they began.